As the invasion of the United States of America had officially begun at midnight on October the 4th, within the Midland-Odessa campaign, within the South Central invasion sector as a whole within the country, as there were multiple different invasion sectors that were divvied up according to the coalition war plan, the fighting initiating in the Midland-Odessa battle space mostly began at 12:30 a.m., by which time emerging People's Armed Police shock forces had left their CCP regime properties, proceeding down the local roads towards their major objectives, which were either to be captured and or destroyed, as there were multiple defending forces to contend with in this area, including some exceedingly well-armed local militia forces. Not only were they well-armed, they were very well-trained and very cohesive and well-led forces for the most part, as many of the members of these militias were military veterans and other types of trained personnel. These forces, as mentioned, could pose a threat to certain operations that were taking place, not only within the Midland-Odessa battle space itself, but also even beyond, as the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6, with the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army, were now racing across the border, headed for their first major logistical resupply dump, which was in the small city of Big Spring, Texas, immediately to the east of the Midland-Odessa battle space and effectively off the map. As many operations initiated at 12:30 a.m. in the order of events, there were two final major battles that began at 12:30 a.m., which were the flank clearance operations of two different militias, one comprised of 750 personnel, or effectively the same size as a typical U.S. Army battalion, as these personnel, for the most part, were mostly even clad in the current U.S. Army attire and even had U.S. military-grade weaponry. The other militia, slightly smaller, had a compound to the south of the city of Odessa in its outermost southern suburbs. These forces posed a direct threat to the key operation taking place to capture the ICE detention facility, along with clearing it and destroying the adjacent forward operating base created by and for the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, as this battalion was to be destroyed and annihilated as a fighting force, so they could not threaten the People's Armed Police and their agenda for this area. As the militia located to the south of Midland in a rural village known as Medkif was effectively conducting training activities at the time of this invasion, as the People's Armed Police Armored Battalion from its 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division of the PAP was tasked with destroying this threat immediately, as the forces within this armored battalion raced off of their CCP regime ranch property, which was disguising their unit for all of these years until they got the signal for the invasion, and raced down the local county road of 3095, which had an S-bend which effectively connected to another rural road known as 2401, which went through this area. As we go to the map of this particular area, the 3095 road had an S-bend just to the west and off of this map, which connected at a T intersection with 2401, which was a north-south route, and then turned into an east-west route, with another road in this area being County Road 131. As this, being the small rural village of Medkif, was essentially comprised of a number of country homes along these routes, as well as a trailer park, a church, an irrigation distribution supply company, a restaurant, a ranch, and multiple oil derricks and oil storage containers that were located throughout this town. There was also a garage slash oil change compound of sorts that was located to the south of the trailer park. It also has to be noted that not only did all the militia members in the 7 major militias in the Midland-Odessa area contribute to the purchase of their illegal arms, which they acquired off the black market from shady Eastern European arms dealers who siphoned weapons off from the Great Eastern European Proxy War, many being American and or European made, and sent them to the cartels in Mexico as the cartels purchased many of these weapons. And these militias utilized straw buyers from among their ranks to go and make contact with and purchase weapons from these cartels. Many of these militias had very wealthy backers that were either members or supporters of these militias who contributed alongside of the members themselves, all chipping in to purchase these extremely expensive, potent, heavy weapons. Again, this militia compound was essentially the militia commander's home, as this militia commander was effectively a double-digit millionaire, and he had a large 4,500 square foot home, 3-car garage, 2 metal buildings, or metal barn-type buildings, and a regular barn, which was converted into the headquarters building or command center for the militia, which was surrounded by a protective berm with 1 entry and exit point. And under the property, so this was a swimming pool and a pool house, under the property was a tunnel network which connected the command bunker, which would be used in times of emergency to command the militia, which connected to this metal barn type building, and this particular barn right here, as this yellow indicates underground. This was the command center in times of conflict. The trench systems, which were dug on the property within its fencing and off the property in fields that technically weren't part of the property but were utilized anyway, as many of the locals of Medkif and slightly beyond were militia members in terms of the male population, it was agreed to that they would dig these trench and foxhole systems around the property and outside of it to protect it from any type of determined attack. Again, these militias were originally community defense organizations and or community watch organizations that morphed into full-blown militarized militias as the civil unrest and the foreign criminal elements that had permeated the nation got louder and ever more destructive. As these militias organized around community defense principles, they, however, were not fully ready for the other foreign elements that had infiltrated the nation, which were the Trojan shock forces of the Sino-Russian coalition, which had remained extremely quiet while on their CCP regime properties while they awaited the signal for the invasion, whereas the foreign criminal elements were the ones causing the trouble and all the proverbial and literal noise. However, these militias, as they prepared to fight foreign gangs and criminal elements, were again not fully prepared to bear the brunt of the heavy coalition assault which be levied upon them by, in this particular sector, the People's Armed Police shock forces of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division. As the 2nd Brigade, out of the 1st and 2nd Brigades, which comprised the division, was responsible for the Midland area of the battle space, as the AO was divided roughly in half between the 2nd Brigade's area of responsibility and the 1st Brigade's area of responsibility. The 2nd Brigade would contribute one of its armored battalions, which again were comprised of 4 light tank companies, 3 armored infantry companies, and their headquarters and support company, to assault this militia force, which could potentially pose a direct threat to the advance of the external invasion prong, as within 8 hours' time they were due to arrive at Big Spring, which was off the map and further east, as that was their major logistical resupply dump. These militia forces could potentially be a destructive partisan-like element that could possibly, if they were aware of it, attack the supply dump itself, which would be absolutely catastrophic for the coalition. and would throw a major wrench in their timetable, or could effectively cause enough distraction to the advancing forces that they would have to stop and engage these forces, which would also throw a wrench in the timetable, as the invasion was moving according to a strict timetable within the usage of fourth generation warfare doctrines, which comprised essentially the external invasion forces acting as the heavy-handed reinforcements for the Trojan shock armies, which were already in every corner of the land and even deep inland doing the heavy lifting. It was the effective job of the Trojan shock forces to ensure that they had crushed any and all resistance within their areas of operation, as this militia would be the first to be engaged by this armored battalion. There'd be another slightly larger militia immediately to the slight south and west of Midland that would also be dealt with slightly later. However, this militia was the most pressing priority, as they were the closest to the Big Spring area. As these forces moved off their CCP regime property at midnight, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had occurred, as well as the usage in this battle space and all of the other primary battle spaces of very powerful electronic warfare jamming to completely and totally nullify American ISR and communications capabilities, this battalion raced down 3095, which was a north-southbound road, which eventually made an S-bend and went east to west, where it connected with another road known as 2401. These were county roads in the area that connected at a T intersection after the S-bend, and the 2401 moved at a 90-degree angle from a north-south route to an east-west route at the T intersection where 3095 and 2401 came together. As the battalion, being led by one of its 4 light tank companies, with 2 armored infantry companies following behind, with the other remaining 3 light tank companies and 1 armored infantry company following them, leaving the headquarters and support company on the CCP regime property to run supplies down 3095 to the combat forces engaged in the battle, which would be 3 total companies, 1 light tank and 2 armored infantry. These forces, as they moved toward Medkif, had effectively alerted local civilians in the area that there were foreign military and or paramilitary forces, which as the PAP was paramilitary, on American soil. And in a frantic panic, as we go to the map of this area, the local that had lived in Medkif, as it came down 3095, had effectively sped down the road where 3095 at this T intersection connects with 2401 and raced into the militia compound to alert the militia leadership of what was happening, what they had seen, as there was no communications capabilities due to the ASAT cyber strikes as well as the electronic warfare jamming, and hence all messages had to be spread by foot or by vehicle, line of sight, or earshot communications. And as these forces rapidly spread word to one another, they got into their battle stations. As again, this militia at this time was conducting a 3-day training operation when the invasion had kicked off, as there were many technicals parked on this property, and each technical could carry between 7 to 10 passengers, as most of them were pickup trucks, although there some were SUVs that could carry slightly less, roughly 7. They were all parked on this property, and others had left the property or moved to other parts of the property to get into their battle stations or fighting positions for this opening operation. There were even ambulances that were effectively makeshift ambulances that had been purchased by the militia leader, who was again a double-digit millionaire, and the other members contributed their own technicals to the militia, as well as ATVs. So there was a number of ATVs in use by this militia force and others, as they were very efficient vehicles for quick hit-and-run attacks, as well as spreading messages and scouting operations. As the battle kicked off and the People's Armed Police were coming down 3095 at the S-bend to turn eastbound on this road, the light tank company led the assault down the road system, while an armored infantry company peeled off to the north of the assaulting light tank company to clear the flanks, as again the coalition forces had total ISR dominance over the battlefield. They could see anything and everything moving as they had their vehicle/dismounted based quadcopter ISR assets, which could see at the lower levels and map the area in real time, in conjunction with the high altitude drones, in conjunction with satellite assets above them, all interlocking to map the battle space in real time, plotting enemy and friendly positions as the battle unfolded. As the Chinese effectively had an AI combat cloud, as it was called, or the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which crunched various domains of data by the millisecond and updated everything by the second, as well as also effectively advising these forces in real time on their angle and traverse of weapons and tactical movements according to terrain layouts, building layouts, and enemy activity and more. As this light tank column of the Type 62G light tanks of the light tank company that was leading the combat companies down 3095 from their CCP regime property had turned and moved down the road. Eventually, at the opening of the map, they would be in this particular position about to advance further, but they would encounter a maelstrom, a hellacious storm of enemy fire, which would be extremely intense, even though it would be relatively short-lived, as this battle would only last an hour and 15 minutes. The fighting would be just as intense as if the People's Armed Police were fighting a real military unit, just simply based on the weaponry possessed by this militia alone. This militia had access to anti-tank guided missiles, such as the TOW missile systems, as well as Javelin ATGMs. They also had Claymore mines, and they had improvised fertilizer-based devices with ball bearings guarding the entrance to the driveway to the large mansion. They also had M19 anti-tank mines, as well as M250 cal heavy machine guns. They also had their 240 Bravo general purpose machine guns and 240 or M249 rather, light machine guns, which had a very high rate of fire. As they also possessed light anti-armor weapons, such as the American-made rocket-propelled grenades known as the PSRL-1, which were made by Airtronic USA and sent to Ukraine in large numbers during the Great Eastern European proxy conflict. Many of them found their way back and into American hands, as well as also AT-4s, and LAWs and other light anti-armor weaponry. These forces being very well equipped, and this militia, as the other militias, were relatively well equipped as well, with the best equipped militia currently carrying out their own assault on the headquarters and support battalion of the entire 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division. This militia even had access to SHORAD capabilities such as Stinger, short-range air defense man-portable systems. As they launched their attack against the headquarters and support battalion of the 1st Brigade, the other American forces throughout the map were under heavy assault, while the artillery battalion of the 2nd Brigade, as the 2nd Brigade was responsible for the Midland side of the battle space, while the 1st Brigade was responsible for the Odessa side, was heavily engaged in the assault for the international air and spaceport of Midland, as it was being attacked by 2 battalions from the 2nd Brigade, 1 armored and 1 light mechanized infantry battalion. The artillery battalion was essentially directing all of its firepower at the opening of the campaign on this particular area alone, and they would have to shift their fire to support other forces of the 2nd Brigade in the general north of the map, effectively leaving the operations in the south of the map or south of the city of Midland without any artillery support. As the artillery of both brigades, each brigade had its own artillery battalion, were in high demand throughout the battle space, the air power of the coalition would have to be utilized to make up for this shortcoming. And the coalition air power in this battle space was more than enough to make up for the shortfall in artillery coverage in the south of the battle space as it pertained to the south of the city of Midland. The coalition air power was simply mammoth in terms of its capabilities in the Midland-Odessa battle space, as it consisted of 4 total combat aircraft squadrons, 2 from the Iranian Air Force and 2 from the PLAAF, or Chinese Air Force, as the Iranians contributed a strike aircraft squadron of very potent Su-24 strike aircraft, which could carry a very heavy payload of roughly 18,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as well as them contributing a fighter squadron of F-14 Tomcats, which, while mostly not equipped with air-to-ground munitions at the opening of the invasion, would eventually return equipped with air-to-ground munitions after their air-to-air mission had been complete, as there would no longer be any USAF, U.S. Naval, or Marine Corps aviation to challenge the coalition dominance by 5:30 a.m., when every last vestige of American air power would be fully and thoroughly wiped out. The PLAAF contributing a squadron of their very capable and advanced J-35A fighters from the PLAAF, as it was an analog of the naval version, just the J-35, which was the naval version. These were the main star of the show in terms of fighter aircraft operating in this battle space, as the F-14s would get air-to-air kills against rotary aircraft in this battle space. The J-35s would conduct their combat air patrols strictly against fixed-wing aircraft if the need would arise, as they were equipped with beyond visual range missile capabilities that far exceeded the capabilities of the F-14s, as the BVR capabilities of the J-35 were simply monumental. And these fighter jets effectively protected the airspace above this battle space, which included protecting a KJ-2000 orbiting AWACS aircraft, which was controlling many of the air operations within this sector of the South Central invasion sector as a whole, as they moved in behind the vast array, this armada of aircraft of the coalition as it entered U.S. airspace. The KJ-2000 would orbit the Midland-Odessa battle space, conducting and controlling all air operations of the coalition, while the orbiting Y-9LG electronic warfare / ELINT aircraft would also orbit this battle space to provide potent electronic warfare jamming capabilities for the People's Armed Police forces on the ground. The very powerful JH-7 strike aircraft of the PLAAF, as one squadron of these aircraft had been committed to this battle space, would also drop massive tonnage of air-to-ground ordnance on targets below. And there would even be a JH-7 airstrike by 1:15, or 45 minutes into the battle, now unfolding in Medkif, as the battle would begin at 12:30 and would last until 1:45 rather, which would be an hour and 15-minute long battle. While the Americans would put up very heavy resistance in this particular battle space, ultimately the People's Armed Police would prevail, as they would thoroughly and methodically slaughter the defending forces now holding positions within the Medkif area as they would move through. As the People's Armed Police were a fearless fighting force, as they were highly fanatical pro-regime forces of the CCP regime, effectively the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime, much like the Waffen-SS were of World War II fame for the regime in Germany. These forces, as they were a very heavily equipped paramilitary shock force. These were not a typical gendarmerie. These were very powerful, well-equipped fighting forces, would strike with their very potent mechanized forces and light tank forces, backed up to the hilt by loitering munitions from their own headquarters and support companies' combat drone section, as well as the coalition air power. And these forces would simply ravage the area. As the civilian who was on the road, headed back to Medkif at midnight, had seen the People's Armed Police vehicles that were entering the local road, 3095, he himself had almost been lit up and destroyed by the lead light tank's turret gunner as he had fired a few shots of 12.7 millimeter fire in his direction. Fortunately for him, he made the S-bend turn before the main gun, the 105 millimeter rifled tank gun, could lock on and destroy him with a Frag-T tank shell. Arriving just minutes before the armored column of People's Armed Police forces made it to Medkif, the militia forces, again, had sent their men to populate the trenches and foxhole systems and the anti-tank / machine gun nest bunker adjacent to the driveway in this area. Again, these were the improvised devices which guarded the entry point into the compound itself. And there were other forces that were moving into the trailer park, where some of them even lived. And they were going to defend the fence line / wall along the trailer park, as well as also there being a church in this area, the Irrigation Distribution Supply Company, rural farm homes or country homes, the restaurant at the T-junction. The ranch was also populated as these technicals pulled in to drop off their squad-sized forces to defend that property, while others had moved into this deserty field just to the north of these oil derricks by this gravel drive which led to the oil derricks. They continued on into the deserty fields, and as they were beginning to drop off their forces, 5 minutes in, or 12:35 rather, 48 CH-901A loitering munitions were now arriving on scene, and these forces would be shredded to pieces by the impacts of these devastating loitering munition strikes at the very opening of the map. As 5 minutes in, these devastating loitering munitions would begin to smash various targets throughout this particular battle space, as the technicals dropped off their personnel, again, many of them clad in the current U.S. Army attire with U.S. military weaponry, as this technical was slightly armored, as there were armor plating put up around the vehicle to protect the engine and the bed. This M250 cow gunner is laying down heavy fire in this illustration or animation, while this is a saw gunner or an M249 gunner jumping out of the back of the truck, with these other personnel jumping out of the back. Others had come out of the cab and were moving into positions to lay down fire. But as they were being hit by loitering munition strikes with fragmentation warheads, they were gradually being ripped to shreds. As the light tanks arrived on scene, the Type 62Gs, which for a light tank were still very capable weapons, although nowhere near as good as the Type 15 light tanks. These light tanks were very upgraded light tanks as they were passed down to the People's Armed Police, and had very capable fire control systems as well as laser range finders, and they had stabilized turrets. They could fire on the move, as they had very high velocity 105 millimeter rifled tank guns that could fire a different variety of shells, including depleted uranium shells, as well as tungsten-based sabot ammunition. And HE shells, heat shells, frag T shells, and others. As the light tanks moved into the area at the S-bend, and they moved forward in a single line or single column formation, they had their turrets staggered in order to engage threats on all sides of their column. 360-degree security, mutual fields of fire with every other tank that was with their weapons staggered, with the lead tank facing ahead, scanning a sector of fire roughly 180 degrees. As this position was where the tank column was of the light tank company, consisting of 4 combat platoons and their headquarters platoon, which were the command and logistical elements of the company. The 4 light tank platoons, comprised of 5 Type 62Gs apiece, would move into this area and be stuck there for about 15 minutes. It was the massive heavy fire coming from this machine gun / ATGM nest would end up claiming the lead light tank and completely destroying it, as the lead light tank would be hit by 2 ATGMs, one being a tow ATGM and the other being a javelin fired on top attack mode, which would hit the tank from the top and destroy it and wipe out the crew, along with the hit from the tow missile system, as well as 50 cal fire being fired at the light tank, which effectively wouldn't do anything to the light tank, as the armor was still relatively good enough to withstand, at least in the front, direct hits from certain types of munitions. The side armor and the back armor was where the light tank was weakest, as the side armor was still somewhat strong, especially when adding ERA, or explosive reactive armor, or other types of applique armor to the sides, but the back was by far the weakest, as was the top. And with the top attack mode of the Javelin, it simply annihilated the lead light tank as the tow missile hit the tank directly on the side, as the tank was already beginning to turn its turret and lay down fire into this position. Again, the column would be stuck here for 15 minutes until the airstrike came in from the Su-24. It was called to strike this position and completely wipe out this machine gun / ATGM nest and this particular trench system, which sat in front of the bunker system, as the bunker was higher up and it had a protective berm and a roof with sandbags on top of it. There are many positions from which the personnel inside could fire from, as they had a 360-degree approach as well, and they could cover all avenues of approach. They provided direct support to the personnel that was in this trench system. Were laying down mostly small arms fire, but the occasional AT-4 or PSRL-1 rocket-propelled grenade would fly out of these trenches at these light tanks. Again, the armor on the front especially was good armor and could withstand AT-4 and rocket-propelled grenade strikes, but again, if hit on the side, it was questionable unless there was ERA armor. And as some of these tanks did not have ERA or applique armor put on the sides, they would be vulnerable to these types of attacks. But as they moved into position, and they would lose their first light tank within the first 15 minutes of the operation, other personnel who had gotten up out of these trenches got into wedge formations and were bounding and covering toward these light tanks and were gradually cut down by a combination of heavy machine gun fire from the turret gunners, coaxial machine gun fire from the 7.62 by 54 millimeter coaxial machine gun, and frag T shell fire from the main guns, which blew these personnel into complete scraps of human meat. These 2 half-squad sized elements were bounding and covering in this direction, but were also likewise cut down and destroyed. These trenches and foxholes were under heavy fire from the light tanks as well throughout the first 15 minutes as they moved in, but again got stuck in this position as the lead light tank was destroyed and its crew completely annihilated, with the others effectively sitting for the time being behind it and firing at these positions, as the next tank following behind the lead light tank of their platoon within their company had to effectively take up the responsibilities of the point tank or the lead tank, and now would have to fire into these positions. As the airstrike came in, it would drop a devastating 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance on this position, completely and thoroughly annihilating the personnel that were manning this bunker or machine gun slash ATGM nest, as well as also the trench system that was immediately in front of it. This was effectively cattle grading, as the personnel could cross over the trench to get into the system or get in the bunker this way, or they could get in through the driveway or even from behind it. This trench system would be completely wiped out along with the bunker, as this Su-24 strike came in by 12:45, or merely 15 minutes into the overall battle. As soon as this position was thoroughly smashed by the air-to-ground munitions, the light tanks would continue down 2401 by this point in time. Even as this was going on, within the first 15 minutes, as the flanks had to be cleared and two armored infantry companies peeled off of the armored column, as the light tank company leading the way turned on the S-bend, one armored infantry company continued southwards across the open deserty fields, as the lead combat platoon was in a wedge formation of their vehicles, followed by the other two combat platoons in a line formation like a rolling arrow, with the two combat platoons following up with staggered weapons, while the lead wedge platoon of the armored infantry vehicles had their weapons covering different fields of fire, 180-degree arcs or fields of fire. As they moved in through this area, through the field, militia forces in technicals were beginning to dismount from their technicals at this time in different areas, including in this irrigation, distribution, and supply company compound or business. This was the church. These technicals were destroyed immediately by the time these tanks were in this position. They simply destroyed them with heavy machine gun fire, coax fire, even a few frag T shells just blew them to pieces. While these personnel were arriving into the trailer park, again, some of them even lived in this trailer park, 10 personnel would take position inside of this office, while others were moving around and getting into this building, and others yet still were around the perimeter fencing, as the trailer park would be the site of heavy fighting a little further into the battle, as the PAP armored infantry would arrive on scene to assault the trailer park, as well as the neighboring garage slash oil change compound immediately to the south of it. The other two armored infantry platoons from the company in the north would proceed parallel to the advancing light tank column, while this platoon would storm this ranch property as the fighting opens up and these forces are getting into position, bounding and covering, as this squad would break up into two half squads, and they would bound and cover, laying down fire, exchanging fire. They would be quickly ripped to pieces by the vehicle-based fires from the People's Armed Police vehicles, their Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles with their very powerful 30mm autocannon, 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine guns, and even their HJ-73C shorter-range anti-tank guided missiles if needed. They would also have, in this assault, as each armored infantry platoon consisted of one IFV and 4 armored personnel carriers, the Type 63 variety of APC equipped with a W-85 heavy machine gun, 12.7mm. These were absolutely devastating weapons. And this heavy machine gun and 30mm autocannon fire would simply mow these forces down, blow them into literal pieces. As the squads had dismounted from their vehicles and effectively were in double column rolling shield formations behind their vehicles, the vehicles would smash through the fencing and then get into a single line formation as two squads would peel off to assault this barn, as a squad-sized element had gotten out of this technical in the side yard of this ranch house, entered the ranch itself, got into the barn through this gate in the fencing, and they would took position in here, trying to lay down fire as these two squads breached after these forces outside were wiped out by the vehicles and loitering munition strikes, as this squad would peel off of their APC and hold position outside of the barn. According to building clearance procedures, the vehicles would move ahead and temporarily stop here, where they would engage through this shed these vehicles with heavy machine gun fire and 30-millimeter autocannon fire, which would blow these technicals to pieces as they were visible on this side and on this side of this shed. As the vehicles in the column, after their troops took control of the barn and outside in this field, their other two squads, after moving through this area, one would peel off to check the shed for any hiding personnel, while another squad would peel off to seize control of the house. By this time, as the vehicles of the platoon would stop on the road, which was 131 here, County Road 131, these four technicals that were just disembarking their personnel merely 5 minutes into the battle were all hit and simply ripped to pieces from crashing CH-901A loitering munitions that were now entering the area, as a total of 48 had been fired from their 48-tube TEL-based system operated by the headquarters and support company within this very armored battalion, which sat still on their CCP regime property to run the supplies to the troops that were fighting at the line of contact, while also, again, firing loitering munitions from the original CCP regime property into this battle space to assist their troops on the ground. And the ISR apparatus had an iron grip over this battle space, as the Chinese and Russian AI combat cloud, or effectively the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, effectively was nearly omniscient and could see and know everything that was going on everywhere in the battle space, as the Chinese and Russian coalition operated the largest surveillance grid ever at any time in history known to man, as the sheer amount of quadcopter drones, which were operated at the squad and sometimes platoon levels of the coalition forces, and the high-altitude drones and satellite assets was so massive and so vast, all interlocking together, along with radar and other systems, to be the eyes and ears of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, or effectively the combat cloud of the coalition, the AI combat cloud, as everything was calculated in real time by the millisecond by the AI, and updates were given by the second on the combat data links, which were in the vehicles and also in tablet form, which were handheld by squad level NCOs and up in the coalition. Everything was updated, including the destruction of enemy personnel as they were removed from the map as they were destroyed, or placed on the map as they emerged from hiding, whether underground or from inside of buildings. As these forces were now on the move at the opening, two squads were disembarked from this platoon to check these houses along 3095 before it became 2401 at this T intersection. As they checked these homes, finding them empty, they would then emerge, this squad acting as effectively outside security for this squad as it cleared this house, and then moved in to clear this restaurant, as again, according to building clearance procedures, vehicles and or troops should be outside of a building if any assistance is required, and to cut off escape from enemy personnel. And in this case, this platoon cut off the escape of 4 personnel coming out the back door of the restaurant as they laid down heavy fire, even got some return fire before these 4 were completely mowed down. As there were 8 personnel in this building, one of them tried to shoot at a turret gunner on this light tank, who promptly returned fire with a Frag T shell, which wiped out 4 of the 8 personnel in this building before this squad went in, and the squad arrived in position to lay down supporting fire to allow them to breach. As they breached the restaurant, they methodically went through it and got the last 4 survivors before they would again emerge from the building after they performed their stack team clearance of the building, and would then begin to bound and cover with the other squad from their platoon that was currently outside according to building clearance procedures. As they would bound and cover together alongside of the light tanks in this particular area to provide infantry support to their embattled light tank company, which was dishing out heavy punishment, but also had taken some in return with the loss of one of their 20 light tanks from within their light tank company, as the crew had been completely wiped out by the top attack mode Javelin strike, with the tow missile strike directly on the side of the turret just effectively being a bonus hit, even though it didn't do as much damage as the top attack Javelin did. It just added insult to injury. As the strike came in 15 minutes into the battle, or by 12:45, by the punishing 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, this allowed the light tank company to resume its advance. They would have to send their combat medics from their company's headquarters platoon, as in the light tank company's headquarters platoon, as well as also their armored recovery vehicle, when it would be safe to do so for the latter. At least for the time being, the remaining 19 light tanks in the light tank company from the 4 combat platoons, as there were 19 light tanks left, would continue and resume their advance down the road. The ultimate aim being to completely and thoroughly cut off this particular compound with fields of fire that cut off all escape from the compound, which would essentially mean these light tanks getting to the very end of the road in this particular map, and the armored infantry troops cutting off escape from the south to prevent any surviving forces on the compound from fleeing the area. Early on in the operation, some would already make these attempts, while others took up position in this garage/oil change compound of sorts. Others took up position in the trailer park. Some took position in the church parking lot, but were promptly destroyed again, while others went into the irrigation distribution center, supply distribution center rather, and took position in the building as well as outside of the building, this group being wiped out immediately by light tank fire, this technical being destroyed after the personnel made it into the building. This technical would be destroyed, and the personnel getting out in a wedge formation, bounding ahead, would also be destroyed by a frag T-shell from this light tank after it destroyed their vehicle they emerged from. The fighting was already hellish at the opening of the map, as these 4 technicals were destroyed by light tank fire immediately off the bat, while these 2 particular ATVs, 2 men each, were essentially equipped with PSRL-1 rocket-propelled grenades, or AT-4s or LAWs, which were also a light anti-armor weapon, and these forces were moving through the trailer park to effectively get off this gravel road. This was not a major road. It was just a gravel road that led to rural homes in the area, and they would peel off and get into this deserty field where they would effectively split up into 2 vehicles to assist this group here who were trying to lay down fire into the other tanks that were now moving into the area after these tanks continued moving forward. And the remaining tanks of the company were now at this position. They were engaged in battle and were destroyed, while the armored infantry company in the south had moved through this area by this time and was moving into this area. They were engaging personnel that were effectively using wadis, ravines, and terrain variations to take cover in and lay down fire against these vehicles, while others were hiding amid the oil derricks, where they tried to lay down fire, but were promptly wiped out as the armored infantry vehicles came in their arrow formation and wiped out these personnel before laying down heavy machine gun fire on these personnel and gradually wiping them out within the first 15 minutes, while also laying down heavy fire into the personnel in this area, with 5 from this group trying to escape, being cut down mercilessly by heavy machine gun and 30mm autocannon fire. While personnel in this group were laying down fire at the opening, they too tried to retreat and were mowed down after they got up out of their relatively safe positions by these tiny clumps of trees in this deserty field. As they got up and out of their washouts, wadis, and ravines, they were mercilessly mowed down by the heavy weapons of the People's Armed Police, armored infantry troops, which operated their Type 86 G, infantry fighting vehicles, and their Type 63 heavy machine gun equipped armored personnel carriers. Their W-85 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns shredding personnel to pieces. There's also the 30 millimeter autocannon fire with HE shells, and also HE armor-piercing shells, and also with armor-piercing shells available, standard armor-piercing shells. These were a formidable weapon, with this area, this home off this driveway, being blown to scrap by this 30 millimeter autocannon fire in this animation or illustration. This house on this street being fired at by the heavy machine gun turret on this armor personnel carrier, this Type 63, with also small arms fire being levied upon them as well. This is a 35 millimeter tube-fired grenade from a People's Armed Police personnel behind these two in this line formation, now emerging from the back of their APC to clear this home on this street. In this area, the lead platoon would continue moving up after these personnel were thoroughly annihilated, with one platoon peeling off and going in this direction, and another peeling off and going in this direction as the fighting intensified. As the light tanks, again, were continuing to move, these two squads, after clearing the restaurant, were now bounding and covering alongside of the light tanks, as mentioned earlier, providing infantry support while this ranch was cleared in the process. These forces were all wiped out. At this point in time, this particular ATV had moved up to the road when the lead light tank had been destroyed and used the opportunity for the rear passenger to place two M19 anti-tank mines on the road. But of course, they were seen by the quadcopters, so this would not be any surprise. The improvised devices had also been seen by the surveillance apparatus and would be shot at by the light tank shells, and the mines would be avoided entirely as the light tanks would proceed forward. As this armored infantry platoon moved adjacent to the light tanks, they too had provided support when this operation to clear the ranch was going on, with the vehicles also helping to destroy these two technicals by the time they pulled forward and started laying down fire on them as well, with them moving to the road by the time they moved out and into the road here as well, adjacent to the light tanks. And they would then continue their movement into this area by the time the light tanks had begun moving toward the end of the road on this battle map. But for the time being, the two infantry squads of armored infantry troops from this platoon were bounding and covering alongside of the tank column as it was moving into this area. Two more squads would be disembarked from this platoon as they moved into this area here, with two more squads being disembarked here by the time there were tanks in this position, after these improvised devices made massive explosions after being hit by the 105 millimeter shells. This squad here would be one squad to provide a wedge formation and infantry support facing their northern flank. By the time they had laid down these anti-tank mines early on in the fighting, when the tanks were in this position and the first lead tank was destroyed, they had continued to move into the area, but would be hit by loitering munitions strikes as the loitering munitions arrived on scene merely 5 minutes into the invasion, as this was done right away. And by 12:35, they would be hit as the loitering munitions entered the battle space, as the lead light tank was destroyed relatively fast. And the light tank behind it that had to take its position and would end up going around it, leading the rest of the tanks, would take some mild damage from all the fire coming from these systems until this trench system and bunker were thoroughly destroyed by the airdrop munitions, along with these 4 ATVs trying to move up the driveway at this time. They too were destroyed, as the encapsulated arrow of cyan, encapsulated in purple, indicates that the munitions drop destroyed them, as well as this system, which was taking fire from the light tanks and also would take the airdrop munitions from the Su-24 strike. The light tanks, despite having lost one initially in this operation, were still extremely formidable opponents and could lay down devastating firepower against enemy forces. However, this American militia was no slouch force, as again, they were extremely well armed, well trained, and well led. And although they too had lost all of their ISR capabilities as they operated drones, which were now grounded effectively, the communications down as well still allowed for these personnel to communicate amongst themselves and spread information rapidly, utilizing technical-based or ATV-based communications to spread messages as they moved into their different fighting positions throughout this tiny rural village known as Medkiv. As the light tanks continued on, they continued to lay down fire into these trench positions, as they could now orient all of their firepower in this direction, as staggered weapons were no longer required by the time they got here, as the armored infantry had now cleared the northern flank, and these light tanks were good to go, as the saying went, in terms of shifting all of their firepower towards this compound. As the fighting intensified in this area, it was now also intensifying in the south, as this southernmost armored infantry company wiped out the sizable element at the very opening of the battle. They now, again in their 3 split-up combat platoons, moved slightly off map with the southernmost platoon, while the center platoon moved gradually to 2401 here, and this platoon moved to 2401, and now we're engaging these forces in these buildings. We're firing everything from AT-4s to PSR-01 RPGs out the windows at these personnel, as the militia's ATGM capabilities had mostly been destroyed with the strike on the ATGM/heavy machine gun bunker, which contained a 50 cal as well, or 250 cals rather. There were still a sizable number of available machine guns, whether M250 cals or 240 Bravos, as well as even light machine guns like the M249, or the SAW as they call it. The light anti-armor weapons were slightly more numerous in this militia than were the ATGMs, and many of the trench-based personnel, or some of the personnel in these buildings, had access to AT-4s, LAWs, and again PSR-L1s, and these weapons were being fired at these vehicles of these 3 combat platoons as they left their headquarters platoon further behind in a safer area where they could command the operation of their company, as well as run supplies forward if and when needed. These personnel took position along the road. They had been mowed down by the advancing vehicles of this armored infantry company, as they still had their troops mounted up. This would change very shortly, as this platoon would storm the compound, which was the oil change and garage compound, as this was a relatively large business. They would disembark their squads to begin to clear the premises, as on this premises there were militia technicals, mostly pickup trucks and an SUV, that had moved into position to challenge these forces, as well as 2 ATVs moving up here to fire at these personnel, along with the 50 personnel that were inside of this building, and another pickup truck moving into this area as the SUV and other pickup truck moved down here to lay down fire. These forces would be eradicated by a combination of fire from the vehicles, from the dismounted troops, and from loitering munition strikes coming in from the total of 48 loitering munitions that had entered the battle space after having had been fired from the TEL-based 48-tube system operated by the combat drone section in the headquarters and support company of this armored battalion from their CCP regime ranch property. As the fighting would get very heavy to seize this building as these forces moved in. The light tanks would continuously be exchanging fire along with the addition of these infantry squads, taking position along the tanks to fire as well at these entrenched positions, which were also being hit by loitering munition strikes. The battle had gotten completely chaotic for the American side, as things would get even worse by the strike of 1:15 a.m., or 45 minutes into this battle, as these two ATVs had made it to this position to turn and get into an ambush position. One would be destroyed by a loitering munition strike, while the other would manage to survive, but would end up being destroyed by the advancing light tanks, as they would open fire on the RPG team that had effectively remained. The remaining loitering munitions had spread out throughout this target-rich environment and struck many personnel and trench systems, as well as personnel on these different properties in this area, and assisted all three of these companies wherever the AI targeting system directed these loitering munitions to strike. However, there were still a sizable number of militiamen, especially on the compound and immediately surrounding it, that had to be dealt with, which was why the light tank company was the main focus of this attack, as they carried by far the most formidable weapons of the three companies. While the armored infantry companies were, again, very well equipped with their infantry fighting vehicles and armor personnel carriers, which were equipped with potent heavy machine guns, and the dismounts were very well equipped as well, the light tanks could lay down by far the most devastating firepower and would gradually gain complete and total control of this situation as they continually pounded the American trench systems and buildings on site, including the once opulent mansion of the millionaire leader of this militia, with devastating 105 millimeter shell fires. These shells pulverized everything they struck, especially the heat and the HE shells, as the most potent anti-armor munitions, which were the DU shells and the tungsten-based sabot rounds, were not used in this operation, as they were not needed in this operation, as there was no heavy armor to contend with. However, the Frag-T, heat, and HE shells were used very liberally in this operation, and as some of the tanks would even run out of shells, the headquarters platoon of this company, this light tank company, would have to run shells into these light tanks while they were still under fire, as this was a very heated exchange of fire. Technicals were gradually being blown to scrap in this area, and these trench systems were being hit by 105 millimeter shells, some landing and hitting right in the back of these trench systems and blowing these personnel to pieces. But they would still continually return fire with everything they possessed. Some even fired a few LAWs and a few AT-4s at these light tanks, damaging a few of them. And one more light tank would be lost before the operation ended, and several would be badly damaged, as this was a very, very heavy operation. As 1:15 had struck on the clock, two devastating, potent JH-7 strike aircraft now had flown in to carry out the coup de grace, and would drop a total between them of 12,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance on the compound below, as they would saturate this compound with these devastating munitions. The headquarters building, the barn surrounded by a berm, would be hit with 4 1,000-pound air-to-ground munitions, blasting the barn into oblivion and throwing dirt from the berm in all directions. While even before these munitions were dropped, immediately prior to that, 4 others would be dropped right on this parking area in the side yard of this property and this metal barn and the side of the home, while most of the home was already sagging and gutted from tank shell fire from the 105 millimeter tank guns. 4,000 additional pounds from this JH-7 would be dropped on this property itself, completely blasting the house, the pool house, and all the personnel immediately around it and in it to complete and total annihilation. This barn, this metal barn with 30 personnel in it, which was the other entry and exit point to the underground command bunker, would also be destroyed in the strike with very little left remaining, as the destructive radius was massive of 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions. Even a single 1,000-pound air-to-ground bomb is simply totally devastating. As 4 1,000-pound air-to-ground bombs is just massive in terms of the explosive power. This area was completely wiped out, as was this parking area, as was their headquarters building. This was, again, the coup de grace, which wiped out most of the remaining personnel that remained on the property, although, again, by the time this happened, there would still be the survivors underground that would have to be dealt with, and some on the outermost edges of the property that just barely survived the blast radius because they were in entrenched positions and just far enough away from these explosions. Again, this map is a large area, as this particular part of Medkiv is shown, is a 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south area. Again, a relatively large area, but well within the range of the main guns of these light tanks, and well within the destructive blast radius of these munitions to completely destroy the vast majority of this property. As some personnel were fortunate, again, were in entrenched positions on the perimeter of the property or were just far enough away from the blast radius, they would be dealt with by the advance of the armored infantry troops from the 3 combat platoons of this armored infantry company as they now moved into the area. As they would cross the road just as this strike was taking place, they would now have to fight over the garage compound, while this platoon in the center would provide support, L-vectored fire support, and also lay down heavy fire on this trench system. The platoon in the far south cut off escape, as these 4 all-terrain vehicles with a grand total of 8 personnel were trying to flee the property to not just save their own lives, but they're trying to hurry to the other nearby militia to warn them of what was going on and to ask for help before they too would be assaulted, which would actually come relatively soon after the destruction of this militia in Medkiv. As these personnel tried to flee, they were interdicted by heavy fire from this platoon just off map before they would re-enter the map and would continue towards the back end of this property to its south. They wiped out these personnel as their fields of fire were well within range to cut these personnel down. And also, as these personnel fled on foot, they too would end up being interdicted, as they would still end up being in range of the light tank's firepower, as again, the high-velocity 105 millimeter rifled tank gun had a range that was just in excess of 2 miles and could hit these personnel as they left the area. As the fighting continued to the south to capture the buildings after these forces were destroyed on the outside, as they took positions in their technicals with heavy machine gun fire, which was returned in kind and shredded these technicals to pieces, as these 5 squads of this platoon in the north here had exited. They came together and moved through this area to take positions here, while these vehicles would end up coming around in a single column formation before breaking up into a line formation along the fence with these two squads. While this squad cleared this building and then cleared this building, they would take position in this building, lay down fire from it at this trench system, while this squad would come around this building according to building clearance procedures, with this squad clearing out the surviving members of this original group of 50, as they had been hit by vehicle-based fires even before these vehicles entered and came up against the premises of these two platoons. As this squad moved around the building while this squad cleared the survivors out of it, they then would emerge from the building, bound and cover tactically, and get into position here along with the vehicles of their same platoon. While again, this squad was taking position in the building, these two would be outside, these two would be up here, and the 5 vehicles here, which would be all 5 dismounted squads and their 5 vehicles in this position after they cleared this property. As the fighting to take this property was essentially underway, as the building clearance operations were going on the premises, the fighting over the trailer park, as well as also the irrigation supply distribution company, was also underway. As fighting in the area, again, was very heavy and being conducted by the armored infantry troops, the Northern Armored Infantry Company on the northern flank would send one of its platoons to the south along 2401, where the T intersection was, as these premises needed to be cleared to ensure that there were no surviving militia forces in the area, which would see, again, a platoon of armored infantry moving into this area to clear the trailer park and the irrigation distribution supply company as they moved through the area. As these vehicles now moved to the south onto this road, as the light tanks left them an opening to get through as they were gradually moving ahead. As the vehicles moved in, they dropped off one squad to clear the church, and they would end up exchanging fire with the personnel in these buildings. By this time, these vehicles had wiped these personnel out, along with loitering munition strikes. While these personnel had made it into the building, and there were already 10 in this building, they would have to be cleared out. While this squad cleared the church, the vehicles then in a line formation continued to move down the road and dismounted or sent another squad, as they were already dismounted and they were following alongside their vehicle in a rolling shield formation. One squad would clear these buildings in this premises to ensure that any personnel that were inside would be destroyed. And as this arrow is encapsulated in red, as these personnel made it in, they would be destroyed by this squad clearing this main building on the irrigation, distribution, and supply company premises. While these personnel were mostly already wiped out by vehicle-based fire, the vehicles would continue, and some would take fire from within these buildings as they moved down the street towards the entrance of the trailer park in this particular area. As one squad would be sent in, again, they were already dismounted, to clear the trailer park, they would have to clear these buildings here while this squad moved in and assaulted this building, and they would clear these buildings alongside one another here, as these were just small trailers and relatively easy to flush out. This building and the office building had to be cleared of the personnel that had entered earlier, as they were still posing a threat to the vehicles outside, as one PSRL-1 had been fired and struck very close to the side of one of the Type 63 APCs, which promptly returned fire into the building. This squad, as they exchanged fire from the church windows of this building, eventually just rushed the building and assaulted it after they overcame the fencing in this area and got over it. They entered the building and would assault this building in stack team formations and methodically go through and clear it before they would then essentially rush the other building and clear the other surviving 10 personnel out of it, while their other squad guarded their flanks to the south of this building clearance just by flushing out these trailers to make sure there was no one in the trailers that could fire out at these at this squad as they cleared these buildings. As they then moved into position, this squad would move into position as well and take up position here. As there was no other movement cited by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system on this premises, as there was assumed that nobody was in these buildings didn't need to be checked, at least for the time being, as there could have been non-combatants still in them, but there was no combatant activity that was observed. For the time being, they were left alone, but they would be thoroughly gone through later. For the time being, they took position along this fencing and laid down fire toward the remaining survivors in these trench systems, who laid down fire back. But as seen, personnel in this trench system had been wiped out immediately at the opening by a light tank shell, Frag T shell, with others still surviving but trying to fight back. But eventually the fire drove some of them to try to flee, where they would be cut down mercilessly as they turned to face their attackers, as they tried to flee for safety on this property, but they were cut down and destroyed in the process and would never make it into the fencing into this property. While they were still returning fire from this trench system, their vehicles had been all destroyed from the munitions that were dropped, as well as the heavy fire from the light tanks had already destroyed a few of them in this instance, and the ambulances were destroyed in the airstrikes as well. The platoon that now completely cleared and now occupied this area along the fence of this property, laying down heavy fire into these trenches, and even used flamethrowers from their Type 74 flamethrowers at this particular trench and roasted these personnel alive, as they were just barely within range to operate these systems effectively against these personnel. And they utilized them to great effect, essentially barbecuing the entire pit of these remaining survivors that hadn't been effectively shot in the head or blasted by shrapnel from fragmentation munitions of different types. They were simply roasted alive by the flamethrowers that were utilized in this area. This pure carnage had swept over this area. The defending forces, having been blasted into oblivion by a combination of airstrikes and tank shell fire, and now adding to that the firepower of the dismounted armored infantry in their vehicles, there was simply nowhere to go, as loitering munitions had already helped to take out targets like technicals, blowing them into pieces, or hitting troops in some of the trench systems, or others that were trying to flee in vehicles. The combination of all this firepower had besieged the last remaining survivors into positions that would eventually become their grave sites, as the militias put up the best fight they possibly could with their heavy weapons. It just simply wasn't enough, although they had done some significant damage to the People's Armed Police, as they did manage, again, to destroy 2 light tanks and damage 3 others, and caused some KIAs amongst the People's Armed Police, armored infantry, and the tank crews. They were about to simply be eradicated. As again, these were only 3 of the 7 combat companies of the armored battalion of the PAP carrying out this assault. The rest of their combat companies were to the west and off map, preparing for their next assault, which would occur against the militia located to the southwest of Medkif. As this militia was no longer a threat to the PAP's operations or the external invasion prong that would be moving east of this area in 7 hours' time by the time this battle nearly ended, as it was 8 hours from the launch of the invasion that they would arrive in Big Spring. This militia was now on its last legs, as these trench systems were pummeled heavily now by the light tank fire, which was all directed at these forces, as well as the airstrikes, which had completely flattened this entire compound except for the underground areas and the trenches on the periphery. As personnel tried to flee, again, they were interdicted by the southernmost platoon, which would then move back onto the map and continue to engage these forces before moving to this position here to hold a field of fire watching the south of this compound, while the light tanks, by the time they arrived here and destroyed these forces, again, there was one grouping of 2 personnel on an ATV, as the other one was hit by a loitering munitions strike early on. They tried to ambush with rocket-propelled grenade fire the light tanks, but failed as they were destroyed, as they was already known they were there due to the quadcopter assets. These light tanks laid down heavy fire on these forces, and as they now had a field of fire covering this direction, as these forces were escaping to the south, again, they were well within range of their 105mm rifled tank guns to fire shells at these personnel and completely blow them away, which they did, as well as also interdiction from the armored infantry-based fire to the south of this property, as their final position would be on the side of this trench system after all the personnel in it were eradicated. And the center platoon, while this platoon had wiped out this trench system, would assault the property and clear it, effectively what was left of it anyway, as all the buildings were completely annihilated. One would go underground and take these personnel as prisoners, as this red arrow comes in here. This grouping was cut down, as the arrows encapsulated by red, they were cut down and destroyed, but this red arrow is this squad that entered the underground bunker system and would take the rest prisoners for intelligence value, as they wanted to know more about the other militias in this area, who the militias effectively all had a loose confederation with one another, and the People's Armed Police would hand these personnel over to the MSS as soon as they would be processed in the Laogai system, and the MSS would either torture them for information if they had to, or they would use other coercive means to extract vital information that could be analyzed by the intelligence analysts and processed by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, or effectively China's AI combat cloud, and added to update the actionable intel of the fighting forces as they advanced through this battle space. By the time this area was cleared, as these 5 squads exited their vehicles as they moved onto the premises, they cleared the underground area, took their prisoners, and effectively ensured that everybody else had been wiped out. These vehicles had earlier moved into this position, and these personnel, they had already been wiped out by fire coming from the southernmost platoon and their vehicles, as their armored personnel carriers with their heavy machine guns and their infantry fighting vehicles with their potent 30mm autocannons, even their ATGMs, their HJ-73Cs, as each vehicle had one rail mounted on the roof, had destroyed these technicals and the dismounted infantry personnel in this particular area. The fighting was very intense. Again, the fighting was about as intense as it were fighting the actual military units, simply because of the armaments that these militias had available to them. They were able to cause PAP casualties. But again, the PAP was a very highly aggressive fighting force. Not totally reckless, but they rushed into combat with little regard for their safety, as they were fanatical fighters. Their fighting style was even more aggressive than that of the PLA, who took a much more cautious approach to their combat operations in different areas. While the PAP had total firepower and ISR, communications, IT, and overall technological dominance, as it could be said, they used all of these capabilities to their fullest advantage and completely and thoroughly crushed all resistance in this area, nullifying this militia forever as a fighting force and allowing this operation to lead to their next operation of flank clearance, which would essentially result in a battle erupting with a slightly larger militia force, as this battalion had not even used half of its total combat capacity, as again, it only used 3 of its 7 combat companies to fight in this operation. It would rapidly move on to engage and destroy the other militia, who by now had been warned by refugees now beginning to clog the road as they could hear all the hellish combat erupting around them, with all the tank shell explosions, the air strikes, and loitering munition strikes, and more. Many refugees fled their homes in surrounding areas near Medkiv and told everybody they could in passing what was going on around them. This information slowly made its rounds by vehicle-based refugees, even foot-based refugees and others. The armed reactionary civilians and civilian militias did all they could to get ready for what was coming. As it wasn't just the more professional, better equipped, better armed, better led, and more logistically prepared militias that would be engaged by the PAP, but any armed civilian scene would likewise be engaged. And many of America's armed civilians were not organized or logistically prepared in any way, shape, or form for a real war, and thus would be slaughtered in the many thousands in the Midland-Odessa battle space, while the militias would naturally perform far better as they were far better equipped and prepared for combat. The ordinary armed reactionary civilians, again, would be slaughtered by the proverbial boatload. As this operation was one of the 2 flank clearance operations mentioned happening at 12:30 a.m. We're only 30 minutes into the invasion. The rest of the main operations occurring on the battle space would occur slightly after 12:30, as events are covered in the order of when they unfold on the ground, as the last major flank clearance operation to be covered that began at 12:30 a.m. would be the flank clearance operation unfolding immediately south of the city of Odessa and its southernmost suburbs, as there would be urban and suburban fighting unfolding in this area, in addition to the rural combat. The suburbs would be the site of some devastating, horrifying levels of combat. You would see entire communities razed to the ground by the People's Armed Police shock forces. In this particular illustration or animation, PAP stack teams are clearing this home, as this home has a brick wall in front of it. These are suburban homes next door here. In the back of them, another one. They have brick walls in front of them. This is the road on this side. These forces are burning it down with a Type 74 flamethrower, firing in 35mm tube fire grenades, rifle fire, laying down supporting fire, throwing hand grenades in the upper level of this house, laying supporting fire while this stack team breaches this house to clear it. This house is being burnt to the ground. There would be heavy assaults from PAP vehicles and dismounted troops, as buildings would become fighting positions, as the militia forces would hurl everything they had, the invaders, which even included Molotov cocktails in the very literal sense, or hand grenades as well, as again, these militia forces had access to heavy weaponry, including the PSRL-1 rocket-propelled grenades that the regular armed civilians just didn't possess. In this animation or illustration, in this suburban area, there's heavy combat going on between PAP vehicles turning around these streets here and beginning to exchange fire with these militiamen taking a position behind this brick wall as the dismounted infantry troops had cleared buildings and moved in to clear this building and use it as a fighting position to clear the way of RPG teams or anti-tank guided missile teams ahead of their vehicles to keep their vehicles effectively safe from this type of attack, as well as loitering munition strikes, quadcopter assets mapping the entire area in real time, and again, heavy exchanges of fire between both sides. In the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. The battle, the flank clearance mission operation occurring to the south of the city of Midland, will be covered next, as the PAP Armored Battalion, tasked with this assault from the 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, will move in to the southern outer suburbs of Odessa and assault and destroy this militia at their compound in the area to prevent them from potentially assisting in the primary objective in the south of them, which was the capture and clearance of the ICE detention center for the use of the PAP as a laogai, as the facilities were already prepared, and it was perfect to institute as a rapid laogai, or slave labor camp, for POWs and others, as the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion also had to be destroyed. Any militia force entering the area would have complicated the plan a bit more, and thus this armored battalion from the 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division was tasked with this operation of surrounding and destroying this force. As again, the Medkif area was also important, but for a different reason, as the flank clearance mission to destroy this militia had more to do with the external invasion forces being able to advance unharassed to their major logistical resupply dump just to the east of this battle space in Big Spring. Again, these forces were pulverized by the brutality of the People's Armed Police assault, as buildings were thoroughly ravaged and destroyed in this area from a combination of the ground-based firepower as well as the airstrikes and more. People's Armed Police were a brutally fanatical fighting force, and again had no regard whatsoever at all for the civilian population, as the PLA essentially, for the most part, went by the Geneva Convention and humanitarian law. The PAP did not. They were a paramilitary force and could care less about military law. They were the cream of the crop. They were the elite of the Communist Party of China, or the Chinese Communist Party. They would carry out their orders to the letter and would ensure that America would never be a threat to China again, as their propaganda had told them that they were trying to put China under another century of humiliation, which was quite impossible, as China was the largest superpower ever seen in all of human history, dwarfing all others in terms of conventional military capabilities, in terms of technological capabilities, as China led in virtually all major technology sectors, unbeknownst to most people, as well as also the sheer size of their industrial base and population and skilled labor pool. It was impossible to put China through a century of humiliation, but the People's Armed Police believed it. And because they believed this dangerous lie, they went on a murderous rampage while conquering the United States of America, wreaking revenge on the nation that they saw as their number one enemy, their number one threat. More to come in the next video.